Welcome to Bangladesh Feminist Oral History Project, presented by Bangladesh Feminist Archives. I'm your host, Tanvir Anoy. This project brings together intergenerational Bangladeshi feminists whose work across movements, law, scholarship, and organizing continues to shape our past, present, and futures. Today, I'm deeply honored to be joined by Professor Chaumtoli Huq, a legal scholar, movement lawyer, and transnational feminist whose work sits at the intersection of at labor, migration, human rights, and diasporic politics. Dr. Hogg is professor of law at CUNY School of Law. Before entering academia, she spent many years as a movement lawyer working with immigrant and South Asian workers in the United States, including founding the South Asian Workers' Rights Project and working with the Newark Taxi Workers Alliance. Her work connects grassroots organizing with legal frameworks, focusing on how worker-led movements build power across borders. Through projects like Law at the Margins, Shromik Awaz, and Chai Justice, she has documented the lives and political consciousness of garment workers, tea workers, and migrant communities, linking Bangladesh to global struggles around labor, migration, and justice. Across her scholarship and activism, she brings together feminist, transnational, and decolonial frameworks to rethink labor law and solidarity. Professor Chaumtoli, thank you so much. And let's begin with your early life. What experiences growing up as a Bangladeshi and later moving through diasporic spaces shaped your awareness of justice, migration, and inequality?
Well, thank you so much for reaching out. And I think the Bangladesh Feminist Archives is such an essential, treasure really for our collective history and memory. And so I'm very grateful to participate and to know that this resource is there. So I was actually born in 1971 in September, so in the midst of the Liberation War. And so Bangladesh is sort of infused into my identity just really from birth. And so in terms of like my earlier kind of diasporic identity, my sort of family history is that in 72, my father, who was a left, it still is, a left activist, and very much part of all the left formations, was concerned, and his family was concerned in 1972, as you know from Bangladesh history, that left activists have been attacked and also persecuted. He saw many of his comrades killed right in front of him, and I think at that time, my paternal grandfather, and this happens throughout our history actually, and I'll share later when I interview migrants for my research. He then came to the United States. At that time, believe it or not, because the current context of immigration law doesn't seem like it to be true, but it was a little bit more easier to gain permanent residency. And so that brought our family to the US, and in particular into a very small migrant Bangladeshi community, and further into a community called the Bronx, which is a very working class neighborhood. And so I think that all of this early, childhood, the narrative and rhetoric of liberation war, the very specific experiences of my father being persecuted for his political activism and his desire to see, really a socialist, a Bangladesh that is really for all Bangladeshis, had contributed very much to my politics. I've gone back and forth for different circumstances. My mother raised us here in New York. And although she had education in Dhaka University, but when you come to the United States, it doesn't matter whatever your, educational background is. She then worked and was a member of a healthcare union called 1199. So I think like all of this early history really shaped my understanding of transnationalism, of women's labor, because My father's politics brought him back to Bangladesh. In fact, we all went back to Bangladesh in 1980. If you remember, that was sort of the height of the democracy movement. And I lived in Bangladesh for several years. So, the image of the migrant coming and staying actually is not true, that most people, for different reasons, economically, politically, oftentimes return. So I think all of that really shaped the idea that there's injustice, there's inequality, the role that women play in movement spaces, the way that my mother raised children so that enabled my father to be able to do his activism. All of that, as a child, as a young girl, you're just observing, but these experiences are get imprinted into your brain, some directly experienced. Obviously, in 1971, I was an infant. I didn't know. And some of that was just more the narrative, Anytime someone would meet me, they would say that, oh, you almost died, which is actually true because in October, the Pakistani soldiers bombed our home. I was staying with my grandmother, and that article actually got published in the Pakistani Observer. And so it was, a story, a narrative that was told in our family that like you could have died, with from this bomb blast. And so my name Chaumtoli actually means messenger, and it was given to me by my grandmother, who was an educator for and a proponent of girls' education, and it meant she wanted to see the hope of Bangladesh, and that was her sort of wish and goal. So I'll stop there, but I think some of these early experiences and stories really shaped, what I thought about these migration, justice, feminism, and really the role that women play in upholding stories, cultures, narratives. I think had a profound impact on me.
Thank you so much for sharing such a powerful story from your life. I really appreciate it. Um, so before entering academia, you spent many years as a movement lawyer working with immigrant and South Asian workers in New York. So what first drew you to labor organizing and worker justice?
So I mentioned that I had grew up, we settled in an area in New York City that's called the Bronx. It's actually an area that now has a large concentration of Bangladeshis, like in 2026. But at the time, it was a very newer immigrant community, and my mother worked and was a member of a union. And so through her work experience, kind of I observed that, how hard it is for migrants to work in the US. She was privileged in the sense that she was a member of a union. We had benefits, we had health insurance. And so I realized that actually being a member of a union or some collective organization somehow provides some protection. I also grew up watching neighbors who are undocumented, what we call mixed status, which is maybe in one household, there might be someone who has a citizenship, green card, legal permanent residency, and then others may not for different reasons. And so I saw my neighbors struggle, work long hours, either as domestic workers, taxi drivers, in Jackson Heights, sort of the shari shops. And I think just seeing how hard they were kind of working and still struggling to kind of make a living and make a life in the United States. I think that you know, I didn't have the vocabulary. It was much later that I had the vocabulary. But for example, as a high schooler, I kind of intuitively connected with a lot of my friends who were also immigrants, Caribbean, African American, and that were, I think, because left politics was not a taboo in my household, I was more drawn to like a lot of left organizers, and some of my early political mentors were actually Caribbean and African American left organizers. And so I think they kind of, introduced me to like um, left theoreticians, Marxism, all these things. So Angela Davis. So I'm reading, I'm a high schooler, 16, 17, and I'm reading Angela Davis's Women, Race, and Class because that was handed to me as like, this is what you got to read in order to understand the world. And I finally discovered something that was so like, that really responded to what I was observing. At the same time, in my household, I was introduced to Begum Rokeya. I was introduced to so the role that Bengali feminists, Muslim feminists particularly, played a role in education of girls. That my own grandmother was married when she was 13 years old, and she struggled and fought my grandfather to get her education and instituted the first all-girls school in Noakhali. That's the region of Bangladesh that my ancestors, my family is from. And so I think like, you're in this milieu, you're in this environment that is all these ideas are coming and you're being exposed to ideas, to people. As I mentioned, in 1980, my family went back to Bangladesh. At that time, the late Jafrullah Chaudhry, who was starting Ganashastra Kendro, had recruited my father to work there. And I'm also sort of in this Bangladesh, this moment of like excitement and possibilities. But I also began to notice who was excluded, what voices were actually amplified, even in movement spaces, women, marginalized communities. And so I think that made me very attuned, not just to labor, right? Whose labor is actually either compensated or at least or rewarded or amplified, and then whose labor isn't, whether it's in the United States or whether it's in Bangladesh, right? So there were many women engaged in the projects in Bangladesh, but it was oftentimes the male activists that got most of the attention, right? And so I think all of those, and there's more. I mean, Angela Davis was asked, "What made you an activist?" And to which she responded, "There was not one thing." Right? There's not this like, heroic moment of like this happened and then my brain opened up and I became an activist, right? I think all of these things are the exposure that allows us to form our sense of self and sense of like politics. But I think all those early experiences were, I think, very transformative for me.
Thank you so much. Um, Professor, you founded the South Asian Workers' Rights Project and later worked with the New York Taxi Workers Alliance. So, what did those experiences teach you about the relationship between law, organizing, and worker power?
Great. So before I went to law school, I actually worked in an organization called Saki for South Asian women, and they work with domestic violence survivors. It's now called Saki for Survivors. They changed their name to be survivor centered. And at that time, I began to see how, again, just to see the feminist through line in my work because sometimes, we when we think about feminism, we think about something when we're organizing specifically around women's issues. And since so much of my work is labor, I'm oftentimes not viewed in this category as having this feminist lens, but you know, it's clearly it's embedded in all the organizing because if you think about it, it's really about power, right? Power dynamics, who's included, who's excluded, who has autonomy and say over one's life, and the direction of their life. So when I was at Saki, I began to observe that there were a lot of women working as domestic workers, working in the sari shops. And at that time, I met another amazing activist that you may want to consider interviewing, Nahar Alam. She founded the Andolon, which is an organization for domestic workers. And so while at Saki, we then began to, reach out together because she herself had come to the United States fleeing a relationship of domestic violence. This is something she's public about, so I'm not sharing anything that's confidential. And she then began organizing domestic workers because she herself was a domestic worker. And I, at that time, I had just graduated from college, and so I had been working with her. So I began to see that there were all these South Asian, particularly Bangladeshi immigrants in these low-waged, exploitative jobs. Also, there were many South Asians in taxi industry. I began to see through the Taxi Workers Alliance. So I began exposed to these organizations. And then the third category of workers that I saw were actually Sikh construction workers and Bangladeshi construction workers from the area of Sandeep from in Bangladesh, who would stand on the streets waiting for people to like hire them for the day. They would go and they work on some like construction project. And so when I saw that there was this need and that there was no the law, the legal institution, the political institutions didn't even know this community existed. I then when I fast forward went on to law school, I then when I was graduating, I was thinking, well, what could I do? What role could I play? And I thought very seriously, like, okay, I'm also an immigrant from Bangladesh. I speak Bangla. I have sort of a little bit of understanding of the mainstream political system, but I also understand the community because I was growing up in that community, right? And so that's when I started, and I had the idea of a workers' rights project because I wanted specifically to deal with people who are marginalized within the marginalized, right? And so that's why I was very focused on South Asian Workers' Rights Project. And the project basically provided free legal services to individuals of South Asian descent, so Bangladeshi, but others as well, who experience some uh, injustice or violation at the workplace. And a fundamental, and this kind of goes to my approach of lawyering, I focused on cases where there was organizing happening, either formally, like through Andalan or the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, or with the Bangladeshi construction workers, it was just an informal group of workers, or the Sikh workers, they would organize through the Gurdwara in the area of New York City called Richmond Hill. There was a faith-based Gurdwara Sikh temple where after the workers, if they didn't get a job, they would go and have chai in the morning. And so I wanted to, give my legal support so that it has an exponential impact. So just by supporting them directly, but also to like actually build power. And so that was the South Asian Workers' Rights Project, and I wanted to connect to broader history of organizing. There had been this like very vibrant Asian American organizing. So the project was housed at the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, which is a civil rights organization that has been it was founded in the 70s, but it is connected to a larger, longer history of Asian American organizing. And so I thought that, it made sense for this project to kind of be in that, housed in that organization. What I learned was that you know, if you provide the collective power leads to change. I think that while a individual may be sparked to be engaged in change, like I was, right? But fundamentally, if we want to change systemic and institutional forms of power that oppress, exploit, marginalize communities that we care about, it has to be done through collective strength. And so, because everyone that talked about domestic workers, drivers, they're excluded from legal protection. And so you can't rely only on, there's some limited protection, but you can't rely solely on the law to protect. And so if you want to create new laws, expand the rights, you actually have to organize, you have to fight for them. And so what I learned from that project is that if I lend my legal knowledge towards communities that are fighting for change, the combination of the law and the organizing can be really powerful, and it can bring about change. And it's now that I'm 25 years since graduated from law school, I have now have this long arc where I've actually been able to see, oh wow, when we organized and we brought a case, or we pushed legislators to change the law, that we brought these changes for our community. And I think it really made me understand power and how power circulates through our, starting from our intimate family life, right, in the domestic violence, and then out into our political space, and through state violence, really, because when the state denies you your basic dignity and livelihood, that's a form of violence, right? It's not an injury or wound that you see on yourself. And so I think that that's really what I began to see. But I also know that law has been utilized as a way to deprive communities, right, of their rights. So it's both, when, in law we say it's a sword and a shield, right? It can protect you, but and it can also injure you as well. And knowing the law and the legal system enabled me to kind of, you know, figure out, like, what are the ways that we can actually do the more changing of the legal system, and reduce harm, right? That's like kind of our mindset, because I'm not naive to think that law is going to liberate us. Law is not going to save us, right? But I think that each of us in our respective work can push the needle and can push us towards some of this change.
Thank you so much. And I have learned so much from that answer, and I really appreciate the work you do. Thank you so much for doing that. So, going to the next question is that much of your work connects labor struggles in the United States with labor movements in South Asia. So my question is that how did Bangladesh, and particularly the struggles of garment or tea workers, become central to your research and activism?
Mhm. Well, as I mentioned, because my own personal family's trajectory showed that the link between Bangladesh and the diaspora, that many people, including my father, had to at some point leave Bangladesh because of persecution, that the connection, right? Migration is a function of where one person is no longer safe. Safe meaning economically, politically, or due to other reasons. So I think very early on, um, I knew that there was this thread. It wasn't like here or there, like there's some kind of like binary. that they were always connected. And I remember actually because I was growing up in New York and my mom was raising, and my father was involved in a lot of, remains involved in like left writing and left activism. The way that even narrative circulates. So I went to Columbia undergrad, and I remember this absurd rumor, right? Ah, you know, um, Farhad Bhai's daughter is studying in America on CIA money. And I was like, no, because I was on completely on financial aid. My mom had like lower income. My dad, as an activist, didn't really have much income. So it was funny how that circulated in part, I think, as a rumor to disparage like his political work. So I think I always knew that there were these like connections circulating, but I think on the labor piece, when I was an undergrad, I studied because garment workers, if you remember in the 80s and the 90s, had by that time been said to be it was going to be the kind of what will liberate women, right? And that if women went into wage work, then they would be liberated. So I had studied that and spoke on garment worker issues. I had an opportunity to present on how women were being trafficked within Asia, from Bangladesh to Pakistan, Bangladesh to other parts of the world. So I began to see how economics, gender justice, kind of all, and then migration, not migration, but within the national borders were being kind of like connected. So that brought me interested to see that labor conditions were actually much more connected transnationally. Fast forward, as you know, that with the garment industry, everything that we wear in the US, a large of our clothing is made in Bangladesh. And the clothes may be sold in stores like Walmart, where there's low-waged workers, right? So these corporations essentially not only extract labor out of Asian, Bangladeshi garment workers, they then bring the product here and are sold by low-waged workers, right? So in this calculus, it's workers, whether it's in Asia, Bangladesh, or workers here, some of whom may be also migrants themselves, right? Who are also being exploited. And I think that r- seeing those connections very directly um, brought me to always understand that whatever work that I do has to be connected transnationally. And I think in my early legal work, the case that I think really cemented it is a case involving a migrant domestic worker from Bangladesh who was brought by a diplomat to Bahrain, and then from Bahrain was brought to New York and was kept pretty much isolated in the home for about 9 months. No, was not paid. The idea was that, oh, you should be lucky to be in America. And if you think about how domestic workers are treated in Bangladesh, you eat the leftovers, you don't sleep on the bed, she's, very horrendous conditions. So she managed to escape New York, the New York City apartment that she was staying, and connected to Andalon, that organization that I mentioned earlier. And then that, because I was working with Andalon, they were like, hey, Chaumtoli, we have this really horrible case of a Bangladeshi migrant worker. Would you be able to take on this case? And so we did. And we didn't realize it was a diplomat, and diplomats have a lot of legal protection, but we brought a case, we did a whole organizing campaign. So in that story, when we developed the campaign, we we had to both look at what were the causes that pushed women out from Bangladesh to go into migrant domestic work, but then also what are the laws here that might protect them. So I think that that's the Shamela Begum case. That's also something that's reported in the it was a pretty high profile case. It was reported in the New York Times, and it I think showed the connection between the transnational connections. And because the diplomat was from Bahrain, we I got a lot of questions like, oh, that must happen in, Middle East. It's this kind of exploitation. That's, and so this way in which Islamophobia and Orientalism was beginning to kind of creep in, and so it was very important that we then connected to human rights activists like in Bahrain to make this is not about the ethnicity and nationality of the employer, because labor exploitation happens across the board of all nationalities. That this is really about a international legal system that protects diplomat. So we, through our campaign, pivoted the focus, spotlighted on this legal system. This legal system it's not about whether Bahrainis or Middle Easterns are more exploitative than Europeans. No, that's not the issue. It's that we have this legal system in place that gives them protection, right? Diplomatic immunity. And so our campaign was focused on changing that. And we made some modest progress in terms of, requiring a little bit more process before you can bring someone over. So I'll stop there, but I think that's a good example of how it just lays bare that there is nothing called domestic or international. That actually especially with global capitalism, we are connected, and that we need to, and that's all these systems of oppression, right? Gender, race, sexuality, all of these things get reproduced and used in service oftentimes, right? Of To perpetuate, right, other forms of oppression. So we need to, so even in this campaign, when we're thinking about um like, as feminist women organizer, um, we were attuned to the way that the media was trying to like make this about Islam, the kafala system. There's like, oh, that's because, in Islam and Arab countries, they actually allow slavery of workers, right? Yes, there is a time and a place to make a criticism of that, but not in this particular moment. So that got me connected to garment workers. It's much later that I actually, it was in 2015, later that I actually learned about the tea workers. And I know you have some questions later about that, so I'll hold off in talking about that.
Thank you so much. I will just go to the next question. And we just observed the anniversary of Rana Plaza, and
Yeah.
my question is about that. Is that after the collapse of Rana Plaza, such a tragedy, right? So you conducted research on labor conditions in the garment industry. So looking back, what did that moment reveal about global supply chains and the limits of corporate accountability?
Yeah, I think in 2014, I'd seen the Rama Plaza um, um, tragedy, and when I was at that time, I was in New York and seeing it really unfold, because the media and social media was much more available. And it really moved me to want to then return to Bangladesh to see such a horrific, tragic incidents, like could this have been changed? Could it have been avoided? What could we do? I received a fellowship with the American Institute of Bangladesh Studies, and I was curious because at the time in the labor movement, international labor movement, there was this international agreement between brands, the brands that produce from Bangladesh, and that called the Accord, where they got together to gave monies to set up a system to inspect some of the factories, and that this was being, heralded as the solution to these kind of workplace tragedies. Definitely, there is a place, and I've written on this about global governance agreements. Like, what I mean by that is not regulated by the international public agencies like the UN, international labor organizations, but can corporations privately come together and deal and commit to addressing any workplace human rights violations? And so when I got there and I began to do, I was doing kind of field work. So my interest was, how is this agreement, how is that translating down to the factory, down to the workers? And, in short, most workers didn't know about it, meaning workers would say, yeah, we saw people come inspect as they've always done. But we don't know what they're doing. So they were not given awareness that this major change was happening. And so one of the things that I kind of shift gears, and one of the project that came out of that research was a full-length documentary called Shramik Awaz, Workers' Voices. It struck me that in these policy places, these policy discussions, that workers who are impacted weren't actually being consulted as to the solution. They were presented as, look how horrible, look what happened to them. They died, they're disabled, but they weren't actually involved or engaged in the policy making. And there was some limited engagement with unions. That's true. And some unions were involved, trade unions, but for the most part, it was very top down, right? And so what I learned from interviewing, and that's a film that's available and people can see, and um, it took about a year and a half to do from 2015 to 2017. And so we're now like, 9 years, almost 10 years from the from the film itself. And what came up consistently with the workers is we need to have unions in our every factory, and corporations need to be legally held accountable for any human rights violation. That does not exist today. So while there are a lot of great pronouncements on business and human rights, the role of corporations in promoting human rights, there isn't a way to hold them legally accountable under international law. And there's been a push for that. And you can understand why corporations would want to push back. Corporations are like, well, we can self-correct and self-regulate. And it was always this like voluntary approach. So I guess what we learned is that here was this massive tragedy and there was some organizing happening, but they didn't really push for greater legal accountability. It was accountability in this like, voluntary sense. And so what I learned from workers, and it was very consistent from the documentary, from my field work, is that if we want to prevent this kind of tragedy from happening again, there has to be clear processes by which corporations can be held accountable. Another thing I want to mention here around these measures, here was this safety agreement, and I've written about this as well. The vast majority of workers in the garment industry in Bangladesh are women. When I went to Bangladesh in 2014, and I had um, excuse me, I had actually gone to Bangladesh in 2013, so like in the summer, but I didn't start my project then. And I visited a number of the hospitals where workers were kind of being rehabilitated. And so, of course, loss of limb was one of the injuries. But the highest injury of worker was actually that a lot of women, their pelvises and their bodies were completely destroyed. If you think about who are the women, their age, sort of young, right? 15, 16 to maybe early 20s in that period of life, which is the high reproductive life. And the women began to share with me that I can't have children. I'm no longer useful. And so it was a very painful set of interviews because their value was either as a worker to give money into the household or to reproduce, both of which was taken away. And even though the doctors and the were saying that um, reproductive impact, and I'm broadly, was highest, and the grief and um, derivative impact, right? Because a lot of some husbands took the compensation money and then left their wife and remarried, right? So there's a whole social impact, gendered social impact. And I've written about how even though we say statistically, most garment workers are women, but when it came to actually policy decisions, they completely ignored how women, specifically women workers, were impacted. And I began to write about that and to say, why didn't this global agreement have anything to do with rehabilitating and supporting women given the patriarchy, right? Uh, and and to this day, gender in the international space is treated separately. So there are these like gender agreements, like for example sexual violence, for example harassment is rampant in garment sector, not just in Bangladesh, across all garment sectors, right? But why isn't a mechanism to report gender-based violence not included within a labor agreement, right? Why is that separate? I mean, of course, part of that is the way in which labor excludes any, if they treat worker as a worker, not worker with specific identity, and how that impacts them, right? And so I have written about a critique of this, that a lot of these corporate accountability measures actually treat gender as an afterthought, that they actually don't integrate it into the agreement. Since then, there has been in India and in one other location right now I'm forgetting, where there's been a separate agreement formed with corporations to report and to identify gender-based violence in the workplace. There's been an ILO, International Labor Organization convention on that. So there's been attention to it, but my critique is that that has to be folded. You have to see workers as women in all of their identities. Much we spoke earlier about intersectional identities, and I think that is what I learned, is that we need to. That I think really um, pushed me to continually bring this intersectional lens to these spaces, because we have to look at who's being impacted, what is it they want, what are they seeking as a policy change, and how would it actually positively, materially change their lives. If it's not doing those things, then we have to be critical of these laws, agreements, even if it sounds like, oh, it's so great, right? And that's what I learned from the Accord and the Alliance that really on the factory level, you know, it hadn't really changed much in terms of the workplace. The changes that happened, I have an article on the Accord, and what I find is that any changes in increased wages or attention happen through organizing, not through this Accord. It was almost like there were parallel movements. There was this Accord movement, corporate accountability, and then there was this like labor organizing from the grassroots, right? And now, there's a separate whole conversation kind of with the post-uprising labor. There's been some positive changes, but sadly, I think because, there's a lot more that needs to happen.
Thank you so much for that very detailed, I would say, anecdote. And I'm really grateful that, like, I got to know this, very comprehensive, I would say, details about the incidents and as well the tragedy happened around Rana Plaza. So your scholarship often examines how grassroots movements challenge global labor inequalities. So what role do worker-led organizing and social movements play in transforming labor law and human rights frameworks?
I think I mentioned in the last question that it has to be from below, that the organizing that has to happen really, um, in Bangla, we have, this expression, the matenama. We have to get down into the streets, into the field, and do this organizing from below. As we talk, there's a language in the human rights speak, and so I think that it's really when we're able to build collective power that this that then puts pressure onto these labor and human rights framework. I mentioned that garment workers, the changes they were able to make in terms of increased wages since Rana Plaza has been through organizing. The tea workers in 2015, when they demanded land rights, subsequently they engaged in another project to increase their wages, which increased very slightly. And that also occurred through organizing. So to me, I think it our attention should really be, for me, is like one is what are the barriers or what can facilitate organizing, right? And that's what I am interested in. And then as a legal scholar, how can law facilitate that, support that organizing? And then, or, what are the legal barriers that need to be removed? And I think that that framework informs a lot of my work.
Thank you. So, in your recent work on gender conscious labor environmentalism, you argue that labor exploitation and environmentalism. Uh, Sorry, I'm going to repeat the question again. I'm just, too much,
I know
hard words.
the title is like pretty
Yeah,
long.
absolutely. I know that. Like, and also I have a starter, so I'm going to try it again. Okay. So, in your recent work on the gender conscious labor environmentalism, you argue that labor exploitation and environmental harm are deeply connected for women workers in the global south. So, how did you come to think about these struggles through a feminist lens?
Yeah, I think that because my interest is in all forms of labor, migrant labor here. Also, I've done some research on Bangladeshi migration to Spain and Italy, and then looking at Bangladesh. And so looking at rural looking at garment workers, the predominance of women there. But then when you look at like where are the women coming from rural spaces, doing rural work, that women still play a very pivotal role in food processing, in aquaculture, shrimp and other fish farming. They play homestead agriculture. And so realizing the kind of important role that women play in rural life, and that's the environment, right? The land is their workplace. And then from tea workers, when I was doing the research with tea workers, women would talk about the women were plucking, and they would pluck tea leaves, and they had to pluck a certain amount. And so they would oftentimes be out there in the heat, right? No, very limited access to water or clean water, and also limited access to like even a bathroom. And when I've done my research, I've kind of have been with them and see that how difficult it is. So I, looked at how these, and then even in the factories, the hazards in the factories cause harm. So I began to look, I'd always had this intersectional lens of gender and labor, but I began to also see how a healthy environment could also boost women's working conditions. So, for example, if there were, there are some laws under Bangladesh Labor Code regarding the factory, but what about, and there's some limited laws regarding access to clean water and bathrooms, not enforced for the tea workers, but for women who are working, there are no protections, right? For example, if there's not any restrictions on spraying pesticides, putting covering is not going to help because they'll inhale all of the toxins into their system. So in that piece, I argue that if we support environmental changes and, for example, enforce, which is now a international law, the right to a healthy and clean environment, we regulate pesticides that are coming into the environment. We ensure biodiversity. I show through my article that actually that helps women workers. So a strong environmental justice like framework will help women workers. And so I think this came about through looking at the tea workers when they were telling me, sister, we sometimes have to pluck and it's very high. Well, there are now laws in the US or efforts to, they're called like heat laws. So when the temperature goes up to a certain level, it allows workers to say that they can't work in that time. But oftentimes, if you don't work, you don't get paid. So there's generally a idea within labor law, right? It's not always enforced that when there's a unsafe working conditions, the worker can refuse to work and they will still be compensated, right? Because there's a strong push towards that. We don't really have that. Rana Plaza, if you remember, the building was cracked the night before. They knew the building was already had some defects, but they pushed the workers to go in and work. And many of the workers said that actually we don't really need these, fancy international agreements. If we had a union who then said, no, our workers are not going to work, and you still have to pay them, they had that strength, and they would the building would collapse, but we wouldn't have that much death. So I think that um, centering like women workers, I think helps me to think through like how if we protect our environment, right, then there is a way in which women workers are also protected. There's also, for those who are interested, a very strong thread within the feminist movement called ecofeminism, right? The idea that now there's two strands. There's one that's a bit more essentialist, which is like women, because I think essentialist, and I think also very uh, informed by heteropatriarchy, right? The idea that because women give birth, and therefore they're connected to nature, and that gives them some special relationship to nature, right? The reason, and that's fine. I'm not rejecting that, but my point of eco feminism is that there is something in terms of systems that and the kind of work that women are segregated into doing, right? That makes them more vulnerable to environmental harms. So it's not an essentialist argument. It's more of their structural location within the system that makes them vulnerable for environmental harms, right? And therefore, because they are vulnerable to environmental harms, and this is actually stated in a lot of the international documents, that we need to pay attention to how women workers or women are impacted in this climate, in this environmental degradation. Uh, if we're going to focus on the environment, we have to also look at how it impacts women workers, right? And so that literature of ecofeminism comes out of the global South, out of global women. If you think about in India, the Chipko, the tree huggers, indigenous communities around the world. There's always been that women have been kind of at the forefront of environmental justice movements. The reason why I'm cautious about a more essentialist argument is that it presupposes one that all women, all persons are birthing or will birth, are birthing people, and so I'm a mother, but I don't think there's anything particularly because I gave birth that makes me connected to the nature. I mean, I can be just as destructive to nature. So I think that essentialist kind of feminist essentialism, um, and I could be wrong. Personally, I tend not to believe in that because I've seen how that essentialism has been utilized actually to turn around and actually oppress people. I mean, we're seeing that now in the US with the fight around gender equality and sexual identity, that there's something about women as women that's being attacked, that's being instrumentalized in this way, but there's nothing essentially about being women. Women as a category is structurally, systemically, historically created, right? I don't wake up. It's interesting because I don't wake up, because my name being kind of ambiguous, it's very helpful. I get a lot of emails, Mr. Huq. And so there's nothing like when I wake up, I'm Chaumtoli, right? I'm not Chaumtoli, but because of systemic discrimination and how I'm categorized in a particular way, either as a migrant, as a brown woman, as a woman of color, those are the systems that communicate a particular identity, and that we're challenging that, right, to fight. So anyway, I don't want to go far off field, but my point is that within ecofeminism and feminism generally, there is this kind of tension sometimes to go down this essentialist route and one that's more systemic, structural, and I tend to lean towards that a bit more. And feminists who are more left-leaning, socialists, eco-feminists are where my ideology tends to kind of like float towards. So anyway, those things inform my work around environmentalism.
Thank you so much. Um, so, Professor Chaumtoli, through Law at the Margins, you have built a platform that bridges scholarship, journalism, and activism. So, what inspired you to create this space, and what kinds of stories were you hoping to amplify?
Yeah, I think one of the things I realized is that a big part of what drives my work, whether it's legal, research, is stories. there's people's stories, individual stories. I love to hear people's stories. And but then I began to notice that certain stories were amplified over others. So Law at the Margins was pretty much a way to think about the way that law plays a role and excluding certain voices and what those voices are or those ideas. And it was really kind of a hub. It was intended as a hub for, I mean, in many ways, what the Feminist Archives is doing. It has a similar, intention that there were all of these amazing work that's happening, and I wanted to bring that. I wanted a platform to like showcase them. So, for example, now I'm doing a project called Law Plus Liberation, where similar as you're interviewing me, I've been interviewing organizers and legal activists to comment on the current state of the world. And it's been so illuminating to hear from individuals to talk about their own work and to be able to like have that shared out. A key concept of feminist organizing is this idea of relational organizing, that you really build by building relationships with people uh, versus what has been the dominant form of organizing, which is transactional, right? Which tends to be associated with more male-dominated, masculinist, I'm not saying male, I'm not going in that terms, but masculinist types of organizing, which is that, okay, you do this for me, I'll do this for you, like contract based. Whereas if you see a lot of feminist organizing is about building relationships, right? Values. And so I think like part of Law at the Margins is inspired by two feminists that I was reading. One was Bell Hooks, who's a Black feminist, and has a book called From Margin to Center. And in that book, she talks about how that there's something from one's location, structural location of marginalization, particularly for Black women, that gives them a viewpoint of society that actually gives you, that really tells you what's happening. And then Gayatri Spivak, I didn't have a class with her as an undergrad, but she was a Columbia professor when I was there. And she has also written about sort of subaltern perspectives. So I think that my original thought was, what would happen if I looked at the law from the perspective of those who are marginalized? Like I put myself in that shoe. What would I see? Whose voices would I hear? And that was kind of it's gone through its own, it's been like now 10 years, but it's been a struggle. It's been like you said earlier, it's a passion project. I've been, friends have donated, I've gotten some grants, but it's been hard, it's been hard to like um, make the case that we should center those who are marginalized. Even though we say it, even in our progressive spaces, it's we don't really live it. I think there's a lot of sacrifices when we actually live our politics.
Thank you so much. And also you kind of like answered my next question as
Yeah,
well. So I'm going to like to skip that and go into the next one. So
yeah.
across your work, you emphasize transnational solidarity, connecting migrant workers, garment workers, and other communities resisting exploitation. So how do these solidarities actually get built across borders?
Yeah, I think I also answered that in the earlier. For me, it's really by building relationships. And this work of building relationship is really hard. It takes a long time. Uh, for example, the Tea Worker project, I began to learn about it in 2014, 15. I've gone back, but I didn't actually start to like research and do a project until 2019 because I needed to, for me to write that well or to do that work, I needed to build the relationships with the organizers. I need to build trust. And trust is really important. And also, because I'm, as much as I can, I personally feel like, I'm like born in Bangladesh, but I also have a significant part of my life that's in the United States. And a significant part of my political consciousness that is formed here. And so I, you know, have to be humble and go in with the idea of listening and learning. And so for me, that work, transnational solidarity work, the easiest is to just like have a bunch of people and form a coalition and call it a network. Like we can do that, right? That's easy to do. But I think the harder and more important work is really to build relationships. So that's something that I've been trying to do is like identify, build relationships, support, try to support in whatever ways that I can, organizing efforts. So one example of that is through my domestic garment worker research, I came across an APA, a Reef APA, who was organizing in domestic workers. Because when when garment workers reach a certain age, they're oftentimes laid off or fired. And it's very young. It's because they start very young and they're maybe 16, 17. And by the time they're late 30s, they're laid off, but they still have a whole work life, right? So they also find out that when workers are fired from the garment, then what other job do they have is domestic. So she began to organize domestic workers, and it was all informal. It hadn't been part of any like formal structure, and so over the years, I just kind of uh, would go and like if there were little things, I would go meet and talk, share ideas of domestic worker organizing in US, because I remember I mentioned Andolon, Nahar, and to try to like make groups aware of each other, and occasionally have friends pool resources so that they can have meetings. So sometimes it's as simple as like, if you have a meeting of domestic workers, they're taking their time away from their work or their family. And so when they're coming together, and she's like, something as simple as like, apa, cha nasta dite pari na, like something very simple, but it's so as you know, in terms of our culture, right? Like some of those little things kind of are the glue that bring us together. So I think that's kind of how I've been able to do it, and it's not without conflict. So if you work with one person, then someone else will say, "Oh, why aren't you working with us?" Or I have to be also aware. Sometimes have not publicly done support work because remember I said earlier, some organizers will take that. Oh yeah, this sister gets money from America. When it's all lies, but we have to be careful about like the relationships, the ecosystem that workers are part of. But I think it has to be done through this relationship building individually with organizations, sharing ideas, sharing skills. Um, and it's a very slow work, which is why I think it's important to just know that this work that you're doing is going to be like your it's a long-term work. And in between, you might have certain things that you accomplish, but your commitment has to be really long term.
Thank you so much. And we are like kind of end of our
Yeah,
interview, so I'm
I'm
going to
a
like
lot.
to
I'm good.
no, no worries. Like it's your feminist oral history interview. We can go like as much you want to continue. So I have three more questions for you, but it's for you. Okay. So as a school scholar teaching labor law and critical race theory, how do you bring movement knowledge and grassroots experiences into the classroom?
Yeah, so thank you for that. So since we're coming to the end, the arc of my work, has been sort of organizer, and doing organizing work, then shifting towards more legal work. And then in the last, I would say since 2018, more formally as a full-time law professor. And I will just say that that process was very organic for anyone who's like thinking about their own trajectory. Like each work made me think about sort of the next step. I came to teaching because after years of organizing and movement lawyering, I thought, well, the next generation, like I can continue to do this work until forever. I'm one person. But if I can have this opportunity to be in front of, I have a classroom of 70 people, then maybe of that, there'll be five people that will continue to want to do this labor work. So that's kind of one of the motivation that. And then second is that we're research that wasn't or focus that wasn't being done, particularly on Bangladesh, because and you might know that in the South Asian, even activist spaces like Bangladeshi migrants weren't focused on. And then even in South Asia studies, for the longest time, there was an Indian hegemony of like focus on India was central. And thanks to a lot of scholars and feminist scholars, particularly in Bangladesh, that's been shifted. But I wanted to bring in the sort of Bangladesh legal perspective and focus a lot on like Bangladesh. So I just wanted to kind of what brought me to academia. So in the classroom, I share my examples, stories, cases. I share stories of other activists that I know as case studies. I, when I teach, I always try to have a practice component. I have guest speakers come to talk to the students because my experience is one experience, but as a professor, I want to, create a very pluralist um, education where students are exposed to different ideas. It's not just, just not just Chaumtoli's ideas or Professor Huq's ideas. I want them to be open to other ideas. So I bring critical theory into the classroom because in law there isn't a lot of focus on that. So I think just having a syllabus and thinking really like where can I bring in alternative, movement, grassroots experiences into the classroom, either through speakers, through writing, or through some practical, like actually getting students outside of the classroom. Those have been the ways I've been able to bring it in, yeah, into the classroom.
Thank you. So over the years, over the years, how have you seen the politics of labor, migration, and diaspora change for Bangladeshi and South Asian communities globally?
So I'm ex over the years, I'm excited by the next generation. I still feel part of that generation. I don't know which generation I am in, but I when I see like y you know younger organizers, say in my class, I actually have a lot of Bangladeshi students in my law class. I pretty regularly get emails from folks who are like, "Oh, I'm interested in what you're doing." And so I'm just amazed by I think they're more intersectional, we've always had to battle a lot of these like patriarchy and all of these issues as growing up and in our politics and our movement spaces. And I do think that um, the approach that I'm seeing is that there's more of it's that more of the students, more of the activists have like embodied this intersectional approach, this transnational approach. Like they're not having to like come to it to know it intellectually. They like have been through their organizing doing that work. I do think that also transnationally, there's been greater connections made. This is the work of many, many, many activists and scholars. So there's now a greater awareness and attention to Bangladesh. Of course, also the uprising. Um, you know, despite whatever one might think about the aftermath of it and whether it's successful or not, we can leave that for another discussion. But I think the momentum of young people actually having this authoritarian um, leader to leave, Sheikh Hasina, like to me that young people organize in such a strategic way in Bangladesh, and they have been and thoughtful, uh, and there are concerns, and that's where I think, the feminist perspective and the feminist intervention is important. Um, Not because oh, we need to have more women. When I talk about feminism, it's about power. It's about who's included, who's not included. Yeah. And so I just want to be clear because I think sometimes people think that feminism is just really about, oh, we just is really very narrow. So I think that for me, I've been optimistic about seeing those changes and that Bangladesh is much more in the center of focus, and Bangladeshis are much more in the center of focus. And I think that to me is positive, but we have to do more. We have to be careful that that doesn't lapse into a nationalism. I was re looking at recently online folks are equating Bengaliness to Bangladeshi, where we all know that we have a large indigenous community in Bangladesh. And in fact, as a personal matter, for many, many, many years, um, uh, based on my look and the region of Bangladesh I'm from, like I was never read as Bengali. I was always told that, oh, you look more Nepali or you look more and so these things we have to begin to there are other communities we have to see who's not at the table, right? And I'd like to see more focus on that. But for the most part, I think um, I'm I'm energized by the fact that there is now an understanding that organizing is important and that young people role is important and that we have to actually create the structures that we want to see and that we have to connect, kind of human rights to that. I think that awareness, that political awareness, I think feels m more and more getting traction. I'm not saying it's solved perfect, but me as a teenager, when I started activism and trying to find other Bangladeshis or similar minded, I didn't really find a lot. And so the fact that now, there's more, I think to me is very encouraging.
Thank you so much. So, for the younger generations of Bangladeshi feminists, organizers, and scholars interested in labor justice and transnational solidarity, what lessons from your journey feel most important to carry forward?
Yeah, I think right now the place that I am in is that um, for more feminists to engage in collective forms of organizing, formalizing certain institution. This will enable greater power. So I think for one of the things I think in my career has always been putting the issues on the table, getting people to realize this, like opening up our vantage point, right? Fighting against, the kind of more reactionary ideas. But now I think, even though I've been involved in institution building projects, I think what would be important is to institutionalize, and I don't mean it in a bureaucratic way, but to memorialize our lessons. In many ways, what the Feminist Archive is doing is part of that project to memorialize, to formalize our the power, right? And to begin to like really strategically implement some of these ideas. So I call it the building phase. The a lot of my early work, because we were still battling some of these issues, that oftentimes we were, fighting against things, and now is to move a little bit more affirmatively to what does it mean to be a transnational feminist? And what does it mean? What does that look like to be a Bangladeshi feminist in praxis, in practice, and to really self-evaluate. I think that's another big thing is to really honestly evaluate, like, okay, has my work brought about some change in the lives of people that whoever you identify as your community, right? I think that those are the things that kind of building and developing kind of systems or structures or infrastructure that can hold the politics that we're trying to actually imagine is probably what lesson that I learned that I am now, you know, going to carry through in my next phase of I mean, I'm still alive. I'm still going to be continuing to work. And that's the kind of work that I'm really wanting to do is to set, is to really set some things in place that others can then step into or can continue or can to build on.
Any last words, Professor Chaumtoli?
Uh, Last words is I've said it throughout is I think archiving, I'm now maybe because I'm a researcher, as I'm looking and researching, so much of our stories, our work isn't recorded and memorialized. And I feel very strongly that, and particularly the Feminist Archive is one great example of doing just that. But, you know, it's really important I mean, for us to know where we're going, we need to know where we were at, and it sounds very cliched. But my last word would be like, whether you're a organizer or a scholar or whatever work you're doing, individually, there's a lot we can do to like memorialize and record our stories. And because sometimes when I go and research and I see there's not like tea workers, there wasn't I didn't have a chance to talk about Chai Justice, like collecting all the interviews that I did of tea worker women is now on this website called Chai Justice. And I did that because then now, moving forward, if someone else wants to take those interviews and then build on it, then they can build on it. Um, but there hadn't really been a lot of things that were, that were organized and put together. So my last words would be that we're whether you're a scholar or not scholar, wherever you are, I think recording our stories, even simple as opening the tape recorder and talking to your parents about 1971 and their experience, or about this uprising, whatever, I think can be so powerful resource for us, for our collective memory, for our collective history. And because I'm afraid that a lot of things are not being recorded or misrepresented or just last example, I'm trying to look at 1972, the Jatiyo Raki Bahini and the persecution of left activists, because that's very much part of my personal and political story. There's very little written about that, right? Um, and many of those folks may slowly be of age where they're passing away. So this is a long last word, but I guess in short, it is that we can all play a role in preserving our collective history, even if it's uncomfortable history, and preserving and recording it, because I think that will really help us to heal, to help us to like move forward, really on solid ground in terms of bringing some of these issues of justice forward. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Chaumtoli Huq. Thank you so much for your generosity, your clarity, and your deep commitment to justice across borders. Your work reminds us that labor struggles, feminist politics, and migration are not separate, but they are deeply interconnected. To all of you watching, thank you so much for joining us. And this is Bangladesh Feminist Oral History Project, a living archive of voices that continue to shape feminist histories, struggles, and futures. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and support the Bangladesh Feminist Archives as we continue documenting stories of resistance, labor, and transnational solidarity. Thank you so much again. Thank you so much, Professor Chaumtoli, and thank you so much for all of you being with us.